you for tuning into From the Cowboy State podcast. I'm your host, Michaela Getz. This is the University of Wyoming Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources podcast. This is season 2, episode 2, and today we have Dr. Derek Scasta joining us. I'm going to turn it over to him and introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Michaela. So my name is Derek Scasta. I'm a faculty member here at the University of Wyoming, and I'm based in Laramie, and I've been in Wyoming about 10 years. Before that, I started my career as a county extension agent in Texas. Did that for about 8 years. So
fantastic. So you said you were in Texas, and now you're up here at the University of Wyoming, and you are the director of LREC, or the
Laramie Research and Extension Center. Yep. So that's one of our 4 ag experiment stations in the state. And I just stepped into that. I was serving as an extension range management specialist before that.
So what led you to first being an extension agent in Texas, but then up here to Wyoming?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I went to Texas A&M University and got my bachelor's degree in range management. And really, I applied for 2 jobs. One was a ranch manager job and one was a county extension agent job. And I got the county extension agent job, and it was in far west Texas. Got to work with some really cool big ranches there, and moved to a second county and spent some time there. Had more row crop production in addition to cow-calf, beef cattle production. And eventually decided I wanted to go back to graduate school. And I had done a master's degree in there, but I decided to go to Oklahoma State University and work on my PhD, kind of around cattle grazing on rangelands, fire-related questions too. And then, this job came open in Wyoming. And I thought, the culture and the questions and all of that would be a good fit. And it certainly has been. So.
That's really great. Well, I know LREC and then, university, while you were in your faculty position, we're lucky to have you. Everything I've heard is if you have a rangeland question, go to Derek. And then, previously we had Bart on the podcast. So go to Derek, go to Barton. So you guys have been assets. Absolutely.
Barton's a good colleague.
And believe it or not, even though, we're talking about range right now, that's actually not the topic of the podcast today, but I am going to ask you one more question. What really drove you to specialize in rangeland management?
I think I was always really interested in the livestock side of things, particularly sheep and cattle. And some people come into range with a real interest in ecology and biodiversity. Right. But I was more interested in the agricultural perspectives on range and ranches and how they're managed. And so I kind of went on a bit of a tangent for my master's degree and worked in crops and enjoy crop production. It's really important. But what I really like is, range management, especially around grazing related issues. And so, I just think that's really exciting, and it continues to be interesting and entertaining and challenging. So I think it's important work.
Absolutely. And I think that's an interesting side of the ranching operations that folks don't always think about when they're starting up their operations. The cow-calf cycles or the calving cycles, what have you, those are focused around when your grasses are growing. And that rangeland aspect, that plays heavily into it. So I think that's a really interesting aspect that, like I said, when folks are starting up their operations or looking to get into that, people don't necessarily think range, livestock. We kind of separate out the two, but they go hand in hand so much, or so much more maybe than people give it credit for,
They do. I mean, the discipline of range management arose out of a crisis of grazing on Western public lands and how to do that the best, in an optimal way. But, there's ways to do it really well for the land, but there's also ways to do it really well for the animals. So they're very interrelated, and range in a place like Wyoming is the critical base for these livestock operations and the wildlife that use these lands as well. So they're pretty linked.
Absolutely. And that ties us right into, my next question for you and our topic for today. So today we are talking about wild horse management, horses and burros, and the ecology and everything that kind of goes into this topic. So how did you get led into your wild horse management research?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's not been a direct linear path. I probably first became aware of wild horses. I had an uncle that lived in Seminole, Texas. You might know where Seminole is.
Yeah.
And he had two BLM horses he had adopted and had trained. And so those were the first, quote, wild horses I was ever around.
Right.
And then I came and interviewed in Wyoming, and I got a lot of questions about horses. And Wyoming has usually the second most wild horses of all the western states. And when I went back to Stillwater, there was a couple of trailer loads coming through town with wild horses that were being shipped from the west to private pastures in the Midwest.
Mm-hmm.
And so at the time, it was really a big issue. There was some litigation, there was some funding. And so just kind of dove right in because it was high on stakeholders' lists of a problem that needed some attention. And Wyoming is it's actually a really great place to work on it because Wyoming has been pretty proactive in managing horses here.
Yeah, absolutely. So, running through this, we kind of talked about how we wanted to dive into the topic. And you brought up a really good point. You can't talk about wild horses in any of the states in the United States without talking about how they were actually reintroduced. And as a horse person, my dad's always had horses. I didn't even really realize that they were reintroduced into North America. So can you tell us a little bit about that process of the reintroduction of horses into North America?
You bet. So the genus Equus, which would encompass all equids, donkeys, horses, zebras, is known to have evolved in North America. And there used to be a number of different species, very different from the horses we think about today. Some of those weren't even single-toed, like the single, toe or single-hoofed horse that we know today. And they had very different diets and sizes. So Equus was this diverse genus of a lot of different, horses or equids. And something happened on the continent of North America around 10,000 years ago where they ultimately went extinct. And we don't really know why, probably disease, hunting, climatic change in weather. Mm-hmm. But before that extinction event, they had started to radiate around the world. And so they actually survived in other places. And it's thought that in 1493, Columbus came back to North America on a second voyage, and it's thought that's when those horses were reintroduced to North America. What's important is those horses had been domesticated and selected for, through breeding for certain features and characteristics. So, North America certainly did evolve. The ecology did evolve with horses and a diversity of horses, but there was a period of thousands of years where they were not present, and then they were reintroduced. So the horses of today are largely, the outcome of that reintroduction process. So that is an important part of the story.
Absolutely. Okay, that's interesting. So all of these, and I guess let me reiterate, what I heard. So all of the wild horses that we have in North America, they're all descended from domesticated horses that were brought over in 1493 from Columbus.
Correct. And there were, there were repeated reintroductions after that through military and exploration, and in some cases, large escapes or releases, particularly through revolt of indigenous people. Right. But yeah, absolutely. That's the accepted idea, is that all of the horses that are wild today originated from those reintroduced horses in the late 1400s.
Interesting. Okay. We've talked about how horses and everything descended, reintroduced to North America, what have you. So I guess my next question is, with Wyoming having so many horses populated in the state, can you talk to us about modern protections, current laws, everything like that that exist for these horses, burros, et cetera, that exist on the state? Are there different protections for the reservation versus the rest of the state, and in private lands, et cetera?
Yeah. So there's a lot there to unpack.
Okay.
So importantly, horses are primarily free roaming in the western states.
Okay.
And the state with the most horses is Nevada, by far. And Wyoming is usually second or third. California can have quite a few. Utah can also be close in that kind of 2, 3, and 4 slot.
Mm-hmm.
Burros are more predominantly in the Southwest,
Okay.
mainly in places like Arizona, Southern Nevada, and Utah. You can think of like the Mojave Desert as a place you might see burros. And as these horses, reproduced and occupied Western lands, they really were kind of relegated to the least productive areas, kind of pushed out. And that's kind of where they persist today, really harsh, dry places. And there was a lot of attempts to manage those. Some of those attempts were for, reducing conflicts with, say, livestock. But some of them may have been for reproduction, say turning a stud out with a particular group of mares and trying to get those foals later. And there were some concerns with some of those practices and how those horses were treated and their welfare. And so in 1971, President Nixon signed in a really important piece of legislation, and that was the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. And that essentially gave these horses federal protections. One important kind of note is, if we think these horses and burros are not native, so they're an exotic species, they're the only exotic species that are federally protected. Okay. Where we have other federal protections for native species like grizzly bears or some of our native migratory birds, things like that. Now, that 1971 Act was not the end of the story, because there was subsequent legislation. A lot of that revolved around how those horses were going to be inventoried, how the rangelands were going to be managed. And so in 1976, we had FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, and 1978, the Public Rangelands Improvement Act. And those gave some additional mandates to inventory the horses and manage them at some, ideal or optimal population level. Okay, so these protections have continued to evolve. There's been, other, signed laws that have additional provisions in them, but those three, in my mind, are really the big kind of protectors of those horses. Now, what horses do those protect? Those protect horses that are on federal lands, primarily owned by BLM and the Forest Service. So the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. The BLM has the majority of those horses. Okay. Forest Service less so. There can also be horses on tribal lands, as you mentioned. Those are actually not going to fall under this act. Okay, so that's a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is those tribes do not get any funding generally to manage those horses. They're pretty under-resourced. The opportunity is, if they can find those resources, they're not as bound to some of the federal mandates for how or what they do with those horses.
Right.
And just to give you a comparison, when we talk about wild horses, you'll hear terms like feral horses and free roaming horses, all kinds of things. we often have not helped our tribal nations manage their horses as a society generally. Okay. So we talk about the state of Nevada. They've got the most horses. The Navajo Nation probably has more wild horses and burros than the state of Nevada. Okay. So that's just one tribe. So
Right.
it's a little bit like how many horses are there and where are they? There needs to be an asterisk because the tribes have a lot of horses. And I think they deserve more, resources to help manage those.
Okay. So I guess my follow-up question to this would be, you've got this population with an asterisk of horses. What happens, when there is no management of horses being done?
Yeah. That's a good question. And we can think about no management of cattle,
Right.
because there's been feral cattle. There were feral cattle in New Mexico in the Gila wilderness, right? That maybe had escaped. They're reproducing. They become a problem. Okay. So no management of ruminants that are able to reproduce and grow their population becomes a problem. And so if we think about as an example, elk in Wyoming, right? A native free roaming ungulate. We do manage elk, right? Through tags and hunting seasons. Cattle grazing on public lands, it is managed. There's a permit that says there's only a certain number that are allowed on, and there's dates. They can come on, say, July 15, and they go home, say, September 15. Horse grazing is often year-round, and often there's not much management until it becomes a really big problem. In other words, until there's way too many. The rangeland resource often can't sustain that repetitive overgrazing that's too intense. And so we can start to see degradation in our plant communities and soils and things like that.
Right. And so I guess, and I'm sorry, I should have added maybe more asterisks, right, to my question. So is there, and this is probably a dumb question because you're gonna be like, yes, Michaela, of course. Is there competition for resources with, like you just said, our elk, pronghorn? Everybody in Wyoming loves the sage grouse. So what do you see? What are the results that you maybe typically see there? I think you shared a slide with me where there was a photo of horses running off. I don't know if it was pronghorn or elk. What are some of the results you see there? And I guess a sub question to that is, what does BLM or Forest Service do about that? Or is there anything being done about that?
Yeah, so certainly there can be problems. I mean, just like if we mismanaged cattle grazing, we could reduce the habitat quality for sage grouse nesting. We could reduce, sagebrush that is really important for pronghorn browsing. So there are a number of concerns related to not only the reduction of habitat quality for those native wildlife species, but also that physical competition where they may exclude them from certain resources. And you mentioned water. The Wildlife Society put together a wild horse special issue of one of their publications, and someone had documented horses around a spring, just kind of loafing around that spring and running elk off. And so, water can be really discreet in space. And so that physical competition can be a problem as well. So this issue of competition and resource allocation is important because, those land management agencies, they're mandated to have plans that account for multiple uses: recreation, agriculture, wildlife, soil, water, and air, all of those cultural values. So for them, they do need to have management plans, and they do. They put a lot of resources, financial, human resources, into managing those horses. Currently, they're using a number of different strategies. Some of those you might be really familiar with, like BLM will adopt horses out, which is great. And that was my first exposure. But the numbers they're able to adopt doesn't account for that population growth. Okay, so that's just one strategy. Another strategy is reproduction management. And they've been using immunocontraception. One of the products is called PZP, and it is a temporary halt on the contraception in mares. And after several years, that mare would need to be re-inoculated with it. And then kind of the third big strategy is removals. So they're going to gather those horses and they're going to put them somewhere else. And right now the strategy is paying private landowners to take those horses on a contract. So you remember I mentioned Oklahoma? I'd seen those trailer loads of horses in Oklahoma. Today, there are more wild horses on private pastures in Oklahoma than there are on public rangelands in Wyoming.
Okay, interesting.
Now that might be a problem because we're kind of exporting this problem to private lands, other places. So there's concerns about what's the sustainability of that model, and it costs a lot of money. But nonetheless, those agencies put a lot of attention to trying to manage those horses.
Absolutely. And I think the adoption process is really interesting. I wasn't super familiar with it until moving here. I was lucky enough to sit in on a Bill Oliver horsemanship clinic that our local 4-H was doing. And a few of those kids had actually adopted, BLM wild horses. And they had, still the tag numbers where they had been branded on. And that was part of Bill Oliver's horsemanship philosophy, I guess, if you will. And he was just taking the horses through, kind of getting them, kid ready. And it was a really interesting process to see. And, the kids were going through it, and then they had to document what they were doing and send those photos and kind of everything back to BLM, because I think you do have to document what work you do with the horse. You don't just get to walk up and say, oh, I'll take that one. They don't just give them out willy-nilly, but it is interesting to see, and it's a neat program, definitely.
I think it's an important part of the issue, and I think it's a good program. I think it should continue. There's a couple of places here in Wyoming that will take those horses and give them some training. One of those is the Honor Farm in Riverton. And so those horses come out, halter broke, maybe more. Maybe they've been introduced to the saddle, maybe a bridle and bit. And so, those programs have a place. And I think, they create some more value around these horses, which is really exciting. And, again, they can make good horses. As an example, one of my colleagues is a wild horse specialist with the BLM, and he's taken several horses and he's packed big game out on them. He's using them as pack horses for hunting. So, that is a visible, important part of the issue for sure. Absolutely.
Just to circle back on something you said previously, sometimes there is an argument that gets circulated of, cattle are turned out and allowed to graze on grass, free range. Why can't horses do the same? And you started to touch on this briefly, but can we circle back to that a little bit? I know we talked about the range degradation, everything there, but can we talk about that just a little bit more so we really get the full effect of what happens to that range when it really starts to just get knocked down to nothing?
You bet. When it comes to public lands grazing, it is a permitted program that has information that feeds back into the continuation of those permits. So, there's a lot of data collection that happens. There's a lot of observations and record keeping. And if those permittees don't follow the guideline, there can be repercussions for that. And so, a lot of the majority of our ranchers in the West use public lands. They work really well with those agencies, and they pay attention. They're improving the land. They're responsive to issues like drought and moving those animals more rapidly, or in some cases, Michaela, taking a non-use. They may not go to the forest allotment if it's an extremely dry year. And that happened here a couple of years ago, east of Laramie on the forest. Some of those ranchers knew and made plans, and they just took a non-use. That's a very different situation than horses that are grazing year-round that may not take a non-use when we have a drought year roll around.
Yeah.
And the other problem is there's a lag time between when problems occur and when the agencies are able to start removing those horses. It's almost a reactive approach.
Sure.
Where, we've had problems for years. Perhaps now we're in what we call an emergency gather. An emergency gather is where food and water are so limited, those horses might be compromised. That gather gets prioritized, and then that's the trigger, and they get removed. Well, that might be years in the making. Those plant communities, particularly those perennial grasses, they can become damaged. And so paying attention to range condition, the sustainability of grazing, and I think that's what these agencies need to strive for. And they are. I think that's what they want to do. They endeavor to do. But there's some constraints beyond. We have some good federal agencies employees who are smart, hardworking people. Sometimes they want to do something and they get their hands tied, so to speak, by litigation, bureaucracy, and other things. But there is a distinct difference. And there's been a lot of folks that want to make it like horses versus cattle, and that's kind of the argument. And I don't think that's the right argument, because we should be thinking about horses and sage grouse. As a matter of fact, that deserves a lot than it's gotten. But in my mind, it's more, how do we optimize the whole situation where horses don't get in those compromised situations,
Sure.
But there's a lot of social overarching all this, like ranching and ecology and biology of society. So.
Yeah. So has there been any specific work done by UW on these efforts?
Yeah. So we've actually been doing research with horses for a good number of years. Myself, I have a colleague, Jeff Beck, who's a wildlife ecologist. A lot of that we've done together.
Yeah.
I know Matt Kaufman, who's a wildlife ecologist, has been working on the Wind River reservation. So, yeah, we've been looking at a number of different questions related to horses, how they affect sage grouse habitat quality, how they move around the landscape. Sometimes we don't even know where they go. So we've used some GPS tracking devices. Yeah. And lo and behold, sometimes horses aren't even staying on BLM lands at all. They're staying on private lands. One of the things that makes it really hard is we have this land ownership pattern called the checkerboard.
Yep.
And it's a relic of the railroad. And it's alternating square miles of public, private. Most of it's unfenced.
Yeah.
That makes it really hard to manage these horses. And so we put collars on some mares kind of in the red desert. And we had a mare in her entire, however many years we tracked her, was on private land. There was one fence, and somehow she had gotten through it and she never went back. So private landowners, and this is the central to some litigation that's, I think, ongoing. Private landowners will have these horses leaving the federal lands, coming out of their private lands, and they're, basically providing the feed they need.
Right. Yeah. And for those listening who maybe haven't been to Wyoming, haven't seen what Derek's talking about, the checkerboard, if you can visualize it, it is literally a checkerboard, which, again, new to Wyoming person here, I didn't quite understand that, because in Texas, I think Texas, when I left, was 90 and change % private land. So you don't have that checkerboard concept, but then you come up to Wyoming and it is quite literally, if you pull up that like all trails map or just any sort of map that shows you all of those different land designations, it is quite literally a checkerboard, and it's hard to put up or, keep out wildlife. And some people don't even want to keep out wildlife. Some people love it, and then they put out, hay or they've put out grass seed just to put out grass seed to attract wildlife. And like what you're talking about, Derek, then you're actually feeding wild horses or what have you. And this actually kind of leads me into, my next question slash topic, which is the social perceptions slash emotional ties. People love wild horses, and there's a lot of advocacy groups, and there's, we're taught from a young age just because of what? Because of Disney movies, because of songs, I don't know, because of just any and everything, that horses are horses, and they're this idealized concept, not livestock or not a wild animal. And at the end of the day, truly that is what they are. And yes, I'll be the first one to admit, I swear my Red Ronin Texas has a personality of his own, but he is an animal for a purpose at the end of the day. And sometimes I call him not nice names when he's crow hopping in the arena, but
yeah,
it's
it is eye-opening when you start to delve into this issue, because many people are very entrenched. And when I think about the different parties that are very vocal, there are some advocate groups that are very, I would say, constructive, common sense. And then there's kind of activists, and they're completely opposed to any management. And you're right. I mean, horses are incredible. I mean, they changed human society. I think about how I describe the horsepower, or the power in my truck, right? It's horsepower.
Yeah.
We still have these terms that relate back. Well, when we domesticated horses, and you can think about how horses were adopted by plains tribes, it transformed how they did everything, how they traded, how they did warfare, how sedentary versus nomadic they were. So horses and humans are like very closely intertwined. And if you think about horse cultures, the survival of those horses, the more horses you had, that meant your family survived and thrived, right? So then we have media, okay? So we have this show, Spirit, right? This unbridled wild horse. Yeah, movies. That's not even just an American thing. There's similar things like in Australia and other places. And I love horses. I have 3 daughters. We love horses in my house. And I think that's an important part of the conversation, because these horses that are on these Western rangelands, we want their welfare to be optimized. Now, they are free roaming. There's going to be deaths and things like that, but they do need some attention and management, because the alternative is thinking about how animals die. That deserves some attention. So that's all mixed up, and society has to make decisions on how many, how much, and what's going to happen to them. And so it makes it pretty dang difficult.
Oh, it absolutely does. And I think too, it's an interesting conversation of how animals die, and would you rather have an overpopulation, a lack of management, and suffering deaths, or would you rather have the proper management tactics in place, and the best outcomes for all animals across, the states, what have you, if possible? It's just, I agree, it's tough.
It is, and I think, to go back to the horses versus livestock, argument, that's the central point of contention. I don't really think that it is anymore. I mean, the other thing to remember too and know is that the number of livestock on federal lands has been decreasing for decades, for a variety of reasons. But there's been well-documented examples of die-offs of horses. trying to find my notes here so I can tell you what year it was. But, as we get into dry years, not only do they have less feed, they can also have less water. And there were a large group of horses on the Navajo Nation, and the AP Press picked it up, that died around this like shrinking water hole.
Right.
They eventually get mired in the mud as they're trying to drink. Hundreds of horses. Well, that's a pretty gruesome picture, but that has also happened in other countries. And so we have to recognize that these horses are on limited resources in a highly variable environment. And that's not a pleasant thing to come upon, say 200 horse carcasses. So.
No, I completely agree. Well,
hey, let me say one more thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, please. Absolutely.
If we think about domestic animals, what would happen if we had that many, whatever, dogs, cats, cows?
Oh,
right? That would be neglect. That would be neglect, and suffering. So there's got to be a more, robust conversation around that topic. And I don't think there has been.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. If there were 200 dogs in somebody's backyard and that happened, it would be neglect. And then
Be on the news, be on the evening news. And there would probably be fines or penalties. So.
No, I agree. So when you do this presentation in person, what are some of the most frequently asked questions or concerns that you do get at the end of this?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people want to know, how can these issues be communicated to the general public better? Because most people do not live anywhere in proximity to where these horses occur.
Yeah.
The horses in Wyoming are not even that visible. If you think about the horses, the McCullough Peaks horses, east of you, Michaela, do you see them from the road, the horses in the Red Desert? So it's an issue that doesn't affect the larger, American population, but they do care and they should care. And so how do we best communicate that to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, and I guess what is your answer? How do you best communicate that to the public? I guess, and that's tough. I think it's really hard. I see BLM tries to, and I have a strong emphasis here on tries to communicate their roundups with the public on their social media pages. And I see any and every type of comments, and they are simply just trying to say, hey, this is what we're doing. So I guess, do you have suggestions on that?
Well, one point I do want to make is, when an agency like the BLM tries to do something, like get the population down to where it's supposed to be, there's often litigation, right?
Sure.
So the United States is the most litigious society in the world. We love to sue each other more than any other country. So the BLM, when they try to do something, they get sued. On the other hand, when they don't do anything, they get sued. So they're very much stuck between a rock and a hard place. And at times it is only litigation that can help make things happen. And that's unfortunate. I think the reality is, folks need to know there are going to be wild horses. So there's an appropriate management level. And since the 1971 Act was passed, we've never been below that level.
Right.
Right. So there's folks that have a bit of a conspiracy theory mentality that there's this agenda to kill all of the wild horses, rather than manage for what should be a healthy number of horses.
Sure.
So a lot of communication. I mean, the agencies get demonized, and there's a lot of caring, smart people who are trying to do a good job. And I think that's unfortunate. And sometimes those people get ostracized for trying to do their job and a mandate they've been given. So it's an incredibly difficult situation.
Fair enough. All right. Well, technically, that was my last big question for you, but is there anything else you really, through either giving these presentations, through your studies and work, through just, living in Wyoming and working, with through working with Jeff Beck and partnering agencies, is there anything else that you really want to, bring to people's sorry, anything else?
I tell you something that we should talk about that is very uniquely Wyoming. Let me make sure I got all the details up in front of me. I think I had some notes. I think we should talk about what's happened on the River Reservation.
Okay. Absolutely. Awesome. Okay, so let's talk about it. Let's talk about the Wind River Reservation. What's been going on there?
Yeah, so earlier I was talking about how our tribes are under-resourced in terms of people and money to support horse management. So I started doing some work on the reservation, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, and I asked the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Range Con, how many horses he thought they had. And at the time, he gave me a number like several thousand. Okay. And fast forward, and that number has grown to an estimated 10,000 horses. Keep in mind, that would be more than the BLM horses in Wyoming.
Right.
Okay, in the reservation. One of the issues that started happening was these horses were moving into higher and higher elevations in places where we have some wildlife that we really need to manage with a lot of intentionality, including bighorn sheep. Okay. Right. So with a lack of federal dollars, and this is a great example of Wyoming doing Wyoming well. Okay. State lawmakers approved several $100,000 to the reservation to begin removing some of those horses. And they have removed several thousand horses. I don't know the exact number. And they have already seen an improvement in range condition in the subsequent growing season. Wow. That is really cool to me. Yeah. In a state with a lot of independence like Wyoming that says, we're not going to wait on those federal dollars. We're going to operationalize some state money. We're going to help Northern Arapaho and Eastern Shoshone best manage their lands. There's still some horses there, I think. But that is a great example of like how Wyoming proactively tries to, build partnerships and manage horses. Yeah. So I think that's a very worthwhile note.
Absolutely. That's really fantastic. Do you know, I know you said that they've removed several thousand. Do you know what that wild horse population on the reservation is down to? Estimate?
No, I do have a note here that they want to have only about 1,000 horses. That's kind of a goal. And I don't know, I can't remember where I got that number. I'm sure from some public press. So they definitely want to get it down to a number.
A healthy, manageable number. Right. That's fantastic. No, that's really great to hear. And I completely agree. That's a great story of Wyoming managing its resources and taking control of that. That's great.
Yep. Okay. Well, if you have any questions about what we talked about, let me know.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. I know it's a busy time of year.
All right. Thanks, McKay. Good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much.
Once again, thank you all for tuning into episode 2, season 2 with Derek Scasta. We will see you guys in a couple weeks.
As a reminder, this is a University of Wyoming Extension podcast. The university is committed to equal opportunity for all persons in all facets of the university's operations and is an equal opportunity /affirmative action employer. If you have any questions, comments, concerns about this statement, please don't hesitate to reach out to mgetz@uwyo.edu, and we can get your questions answered. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns about the podcast as well, again, don't hesitate to reach out to that email address, mgetz@uwyo.edu. Again, this has been a University of Wyoming Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in.